Hi everyone, welcome to our 11th lesson, Jehovah Shammah, in our Names of God study. This name in particular is very special to me. When I say that, I think about a lot of the names, but this one, I think for me, is the first one that I go to in my mind kind of automatically when I'm going through something or when something feels really hard. The first thing that comes to my mind is that the Lord is there and He's there with me. And that is maybe the starting point for all of the other names for me, is that the Lord is there, He's present, and we're going to talk about what there actually means in this context. But, if I can remember that He's there, then I can move forward into all of His other characteristics of the other names that He's revealed to us and figure out how He's there for me in those ways. And so I hope this name rings true for you as being beautiful and special and precious to you. And we'll just jump right in. So we've already said several times in our discussion of the last few names, especially with the shepherd and the sheep, that the shepherd's presence made a difference for the sheep, right? So we talked about in Jehovah Shalom, how the very presence of the shepherd brought peace to the flock, right? He would walk amongst his sheep and it would calm down their spirits. Like there were a lot of different things that they needed to be at peace. But in order for those things to be true, the shepherd had to be physically present to be able to identify the needs of the sheep, right? We've talked about that in Jehovah Sidkenu, how He leads us in paths of righteousness. Well, can't very well lead us if He's not there with us. So the presence of the shepherd in the lives of the sheep is crucial. It's critical for the shepherd to be physically present with the sheep. And so the fact that Jehovah Shammah is a name that the Lord revealed to us, meaning He wants us to know that He's there, is very important, right? It's really crucial for us to understand that our shepherd, our Jehovah, is there with us. And He's bringing us peace, and He's leading us in the paths of righteousness, and He's making us lie down, and He's doing all of these things for us that a good shepherd would, because He's there, okay? So no matter what circumstance that we find ourselves in, presence of our shepherd always makes a difference. It always makes it better. Therefore, it's clear that in order for our God to be a good shepherd, a good Jehovah Ra, He also has to be a good Jehovah Shammah. He has to be there, and He is. And He is in several ways. So the first thing we need to talk about is how this name was revealed. And it was revealed to the people of Israel through the prophet Ezekiel. we need to understand a little bit of background for the Israelites in order for us to understand why Jehovah Shammah was revealed and why it mattered to them, right? So if we step back and we think about the history of the Israelites and their walk with the Lord, they were characterized by the Lord being in their presence, okay? The thing that made them special was not the dietary laws that they followed. It was not that they were not supposed to marry with other nations. It was not that they had to wear their hair in curly cues around their face. It wasn't the clothes that they had. It wasn't any of those things at all. The only thing that made them special and distinct from the rest of the nations of the world was that Jehovah God dwelt physically among them, okay? He made that promise that He would be with them, and that's what made them different. So we're going to go over, I'm going to read a lot of different scriptures just to show you kind of the path of how God told Israel that He would be with them in all the different ways that He was with them, okay? So we start in Genesis 17:7. It's a promise, a covenant that God made with Abram, the father of the Hebrew people. He says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be Elohim to you and to your offspring after you. Meaning, I will be in relationship with you and your offspring, okay? Then in Genesis 28:15, God says, behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. He's talking to Jacob. He says, I am with you. I'm physically with you. Here I am. I'm right here. I'm with you. Then in Exodus 3, this is Moses talking to the burning bush, God in the burning bush. Moses says to Elohim, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And God says back to him, but I will be with you. Okay, I will be with you when you do this thing. Exodus 13, Yahweh went before them, the Israelites. He went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. God manifested himself physically in fire and in cloud, okay, in smoke, in a way that the Israelites could see, and he was physically present with them 24 hours a day, either as fire when it was nighttime so they could see him, or as smoke during the day so they could see him, and they followed him wherever he went. In Exodus 33, Moses is talking to God. We've already talked about this in a prior lesson. The Israelites had already messed up. They had made the golden calf and had worshipped an idol. And Moses is interceding for them to the Lord. And he says to God, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Moses said it. He said, the only thing that makes us different, the only thing that makes us distinct is the fact that you're with us. So if you're not going to go with us, we're not leaving here. We're staying with you. Okay? Exodus chapter 40. For the cloud of Yahweh was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Okay? Here we see fire and smoke again. Okay? The cloud by day, right, where they could see the smoke, the cloud over the tabernacle, the tent where the Lord had set up his dwelling, right? The tent had the cloud by day, and at night it had fire so they could see that he was there. And then skip ahead to 2 Kings chapter 8. The priest brought the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, of the temple. This is where the temple is built by Solomon, and they're bringing the ark in, and it's about to become official. They bring it into the inner sanctuary of the house of the temple, into the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of Yahweh, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of Yahweh filled the house of Yahweh. It physically filled the house. He decided that he was going to be there in that building. He told Solomon to build a temple so that he could put his presence in it. Okay? For hundreds of years, for like 1,500 years, the Israelites had enjoyed, had depended on, and had taken for granted the presence of the Lord. Okay? Yahweh's presence was manifest in some kind of physical way in a very specific geographic location. Okay? We don't really understand that these days because we have the Holy Spirit living inside us. Okay? We have complete access to God anytime we want it. But the Israelites had to go to a very specific longitude and latitude to meet with God. He was in a spot, in a location, okay? He was in Jerusalem, inside the temple, but not just in the temple, inside the Holy of Holies in the temple, okay? He was in the very, very specific, very back part of the temple that one person, one time a year could go into, okay? He was in a geographic spot. And they had to travel from wherever they lived to the temple multiple times a year to interact with the Lord, okay? And while that seems inconvenient, I guess, for us, because we can talk to the Lord anytime, it was for them a sense of comfort because they knew where God was, right? They knew how to get to him. He was in a spot and they could find him, right? And anytime they needed him, that's where they went. And if they didn't feel like they needed him, they also kind of knew, well, if I need him, he's there. But right now, I just don't feel like I need him. Okay? They had gotten to where they took him for granted. Yahweh's presence was what made them who they were. And it's what made them different from every other nation in the entire world. The presence of Yahweh defined them. So then we fast forward to the time of Ezekiel. He was a prophet during the time when Israel and Judah had split, the 10 tribes of Israel in the north, and the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, in Judah in the south. Okay, they each had their own set of kings. Israel had 19 kings, and not any one of them was any good. None of them feared the Lord or followed him. Okay, and eventually Israel was conquered by Assyria. Okay, and taken away into captivity. And then there was Judah, who simultaneously had kings with Israel. They had 20 kings. 8 of those kings followed the Lord. But even those 8 didn't follow him perfectly. They had some issues too. And you can see that when you read in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that they didn't always follow the Lord completely. And eventually Judah, because of this lack of complete obedience, was conquered by Babylon and taken into captivity. In the first few chapters of the book of Ezekiel, if you read it, you'll see that Yahweh takes Ezekiel kind of through the temple in a vision, and he tells him all the ways that Judah had defiled his name in the temple. Okay, then you skip to chapters 10 and 11, and Ezekiel gives a poignant description of the glory of Yahweh leaving the temple. Okay, leaving the temple. He says, write Ichabod over the door frame of the house, because Ichabod means that the Lord has left, right? It means he's vacated it. And so the very thing that defined who the Israelites were was no more, okay? By Ezekiel chapter 11, Jehovah had left the temple. He was no longer in that geographic location anymore. And this was by far the greatest blow to the Israelites that had happened. Okay, bigger than Israel and Judah splitting into separate nations, bigger than Israel being captured by Assyria, bigger than Judah being captured by Babylon, bigger than all of the Israelites being carried away from their homeland that the Lord had promised to them, bigger than all of that. The biggest thing that had happened to them was that God left the temple. And this was huge because even when the Israelites were in captivity, they could rely upon the fact that Yahweh was seated in Jerusalem, in the temple. He was there. He was accessible. If they could somehow make it back there, he would be there. He was there waiting for them, right? That gave them a sense of security. And it symbolized God's blessing on them. But once Yahweh abandoned the temple, the Israelites had no further hope. What did they need to go back home for? Why would they ever worry about going back home? We see in the book of Esther that there are Israelites who are living in Susa, right? In Babylon. In Babylon? In captivity. I forget what the nation was, but they were living in Susa. They hadn't gone back home. Like Mordecai and Esther were Jews who had been given permission to go back and live in their homeland, and they didn't go. They stayed. And it's probably because God wasn't in his temple anymore. There was no pull there. There was no draw to go back there because God had abandoned the temple, and it felt like he had abandoned them. So it's at this point where God had abandoned the temple and there was no hope for the Israelites, that Ezekiel first speaks the name Jehovah Shammah, the Lord is there. In a very poetic way, he paints a picture of the new city for the people of God. Remember, theirs had already been destroyed by Assyria and by Babylon. Jerusalem had been destroyed by Babylon. Apart from the city itself being beautiful, go read the description in Ezekiel. It's an amazing description. Apart from that, Ezekiel reveals that the name of the city, the very defining characteristic of the city itself, would be the Lord is there, Jehovah Shammah. And he says it in Ezekiel 48:35. The circumference of the city shall be 18,000 cubits. And the name of the city from that time on shall be Jehovah Shammah. That communicated just a glimmer of hope to the Israelites, even though they had acted in such a way so as to drive the presence of God from their midst. Elohim, the keeper of promises, would bring them to a city where his presence would dwell continually and forever with them. It was meant to be an encouragement to the people who were in utmost distress. So, how is God there? What does that mean? That word there is a very broad term. We use that in a lot of different ways in our language. So what are some ways that God can be there? Okay, these are where your blanks start on your paper if you're taking notes. The first way God is there, the first way Jehovah Shammah is there, is he is beside us. He is there beside us. Okay, we see that in Psalm 23 verse 4. Okay, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Okay, the valley of the shadow of death. It can also be translated the valley of deep darkness. Okay, so thinking about a shepherd and the sheep, Jehovah Shammah being part of that list in Psalm 23 where David is listing out all of the wonderful things that his shepherd does for him that makes him a good shepherd, right? One of the key things that he says is that he's there. He's Jehovah Shammah. He's with me in this valley. So he's talking about a very specific thing that happened with a flock and the shepherd, okay? There was a time during the year, it was early summer, where the shepherd would take the sheep on a journey from the ranch, from the farm, and he would take them up into the mountain lands to graze all of that land up there. The owner would not go with them. The owner would stay home to run the ranch operations, or to run the farm, or to stay with his family. And this shepherd, who was often a hired hand, would go with the sheep by himself. It would be just the sheep and the shepherd, a very intimate situation, and they would all go together on this journey. They would often entail very long drives, not like a car drive, but like a cattle drive, or in this instance, a sheep drive. Long drives, long journeys. The sheep would move slowly, they would graze as they went, and they would gradually work their way up the mountains behind the receding snow. At that point of the year, the snow-capped mountains, the snow was starting to melt and the water was washing down the mountainside, and it was fertilizing all of that grass, watering it, and it was making it lush and green. And so the sheep would go up the mountain, eat their way up the mountainside, eat that fertile green grass, and follow it all the way up to the top of the mountain. By the late summer, they were well up the mountain, up above the tree line, okay? And with the approach of autumn, the early snows would start to fall back on the top of the mountains, and they would start to force the flock back down to the lower elevations. And finally, toward the end of the summer, when fall was over, toward the end of fall, the sheep would be driven home to the ranch, and they would winter there, and the early part of the spring, they would stay at home at the ranch, okay? This is that segment of the yearly ranch operations that's being described in the second half of Psalm 23, okay? David was intimately acquainted with this, okay? We know that he was a shepherd. We know that he kept sheep. In their very first introduction to David, he's keeping sheep. When Samuel goes in 1 Samuel 16 to the house of Jesse, God sends him there and says, hey, there's somebody there, a man there that I want you to anoint to be the future king of Israel. Samuel goes, and he knows it's the son of Jesse, and Jesse's got all these big, brawny, handsome men in his house, and Samuel picks this one, and God says no, and he picks that one, and God says no, and he goes through all of the brothers, and God said no. And so Samuel looks at Jesse and he says, okay, there's got to be somebody else, because God sent me here and he said to anoint one of your sons. What am I missing? And Jesse says, there remains the youngest, but behold, he's keeping the sheep. So David was likely on this summer-fall journey with the sheep at this point, and somebody had to go get him and bring him back. So David had done this with his sheep. He knew what this was like. During this time, this journey, the flock of sheep is entirely alone with their shepherd. They are in intimate contact with him and under his most personal attention day in and day out. That's why the last verses of Psalm 23 are couched in such intimate first-person language. You'll notice that in verse 4, it switches from being third person, talking about God, to being first person, talking to God. Listen to it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So David is referencing this really intimate time between the shepherd and the sheep when he's saying, you are with me. You are anointing my head. You are preparing a table. He's talking to the Lord. And it's a symbolism of this going up and down this mountain with the shepherd with the sheep by himself. So Psalm 23 verse 4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So this valley, this word valley, that is a term that for us usually means some kind of dark time or something very painful or very hard. Okay, a valley of death, a valley of deep darkness is a period or a season in our life where we're struggling, right? And so the question comes to mind, why would a shepherd lead his sheep into the valley? Why would he lead them into these places? We know that he's in charge of where they go, so why would he take them there? For two reasons. This is on your sheet. Sheep are taken into the valley for two reasons. The first reason is that valleys are the gentlest grade to get them to the top of the mountain. Valleys are the gentlest grade to get the sheep to the top of the mountain. Okay, mountains are like this, right? And sheep aren't mountain climbers. Okay, they can't climb mountains. They don't have claws. They don't have strong legs. They can't go vertical. All they can do is gently walk up a sloping path, a gently sloping path. So a sheep would need to be guided in a way that would get them up the mountain. And a valley is going to do that. It's going to be a gradual incline. It's not going to be just a flat place. It's going to be an incline, and it's going to wind them up the mountainside. Okay, it's a gentler way to get the sheep up the mountain. And the second reason that a shepherd would lead sheep into a valley, excuse me, is because valleys are the well-watered route and contain the richest feeding grounds. They are the well-watered route and contain the richest feeding grounds. Okay, this makes sense to us. If the mountain's like this and there's snow on the top of the mountain, when the snow melts, we just talked about this, it's going to run down the side of the mountain and it's going to collect. If there's a mountain here and a mountain here, and right here is in between the two mountains, it's going to collect right here in this basin, in this valley. Okay, there's going to be really green grass there. There's going to be pools of water for the sheep to drink from. It's going to be an oasis for them on this journey. It's going to be a place for them to get nourishment. Generally, the choicest meadows are in the valleys along the stream banks. If the sheep didn't go through the valleys, they would surely die on the steep trails up the mountain. Okay? They can't do it. They can't hoof their way up that mountain, and they need these refreshing stops in the valley to give them the energy and the water that they need to make it on the rest of the journey. And as Christians, we will soon discover, if we haven't already, that it's in the valleys of our lives that we find refreshment from God himself. Okay? And we know this intuitively. If we are living a life that is just good to go, no struggles, no trials, everything's hunky-dory, then we don't find ourselves drawn to the Lord as much, right? It becomes more of a discipline in those times to spend time with him, to seek him out. But when we feel really needy, when things are hard, when we're struggling, then we are pushed almost into the Lord's presence. We are drawn to him in ways that we would not be when we feel like life is good. Excuse me. So the valleys are the times when we can get nourishment from the Lord himself. And our shepherd knows this when he leads us through the valleys. He knows where we can find strength and sustenance and the gentle grazing despite every threat of disaster around us. He knows. He knows what we need, and he knows how to get us what we need. So it's reassuring for us to discover that there is, even in the dark valley, a source of strength and courage to be found in God. It's when we can look back over our lives and see how the shepherd's hand has guided and sustained us in those dark hours that our faith is renewed. When you've gone through something really hard, whether it's the death of someone you love or an illness, excuse me, or the lack of something that you want or you need, and you find the Lord faithful in that time, then the next time you have a situation like that that's hard, you're going to remember what it felt like for the Lord to be faithful in a dark situation, and that's going to give you more confidence. It's going to give you more faith. And the more times you have like that, the stronger your faith is going to be in the Lord. You're going to remember that he's faithful. And soon that will be your first instinct in times like that, is going to be to immediately go to the Lord and praise him for his faithfulness and thank him for what he's going to do in those dark times. Okay? Doesn't make the dark times any less dark, but it makes it more comforting to know that he's there. Okay? All of this multiplies our confidence in our shepherd, in our Christ. It's the spiritual and emotional and mental exposure to the storms of life that puts stamina into our very being. Because he has led us through without fear before, he can do it again and again and again. And in this knowledge, fear fades away and peace of heart and mind takes its place. And so the basic question is not whether we have few valleys or many valleys. It's not the matter of how dark our valleys are or if they're just a little shadowy. It's what we do with them. It's how we think about them. How do we go through them? Are we plugging in to our shepherd who is there with us in the valley? We have to remember that it's only through these valleys that we can travel on to higher ground with God. So are we making the most of the valleys? Are we leveraging those valleys for our relationship with God? James 1, 2, and 3 talks about this. It says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance." Okay? When we go through hard things and we find the Lord faithful, it helps us to persevere in the next hard thing. And he'll be faithful then too, and then we'll be able to persevere through the next hard thing. Okay? Jehovah Shammah is not a God who's aloof or who's at arm's length. He is always near to us. He is always intervening on behalf of his people. So the first way that the Lord is there is he's beside us, especially in those valleys. The second way that he's there is he has been there. He has been there. Psalm 23 verse 5, the first part says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Okay, now that verse for a lot of my life confused me. It did not make any sense. We're talking about sheep. We're talking about a shepherd, and all of a sudden, he's preparing a table before them in the presence of their enemies. What does that mean? I mean, I have a mental picture of like a table with laying out a tablecloth and putting out like a tea service on the table and having a sheep sit down over here and like, here comes a wolf, sit down over here and we're going to have tea. Like that's the mental picture that I've always had when I've read this verse. And that could not be farther from the truth, okay? There is a word that's used here that is very specific to a shepherd of that time frame in the Middle East, okay? We just said that in the summer, the shepherd takes the sheep to the high mountain countries to graze up there, okay? That high mountain country is called the tablelands. The tablelands, or the mesas. M-E-S-A-S, mesas. Okay, the tablelands or the mesas. So, you can see where we get, you prepare a table before me, a tableland before me. Okay, so how is the shepherd preparing the tablelands before the sheep? Okay, so early in the season, like in the late spring, the shepherd would make that journey that he was going to take the sheep on. He would make it by himself. He would go out alone, and his job during that journey was to take a survey of all of the places that he was planning to take the sheep. He was scoping out the tablelands. He was preparing the tablelands so that when the sheep came through, they would have what they needed. He was looking over it with great care. He was keeping ever in his mind the tableland's best use for his flock during the coming season. Okay? He was going to check for poisonous weeds. He was going to check the area for predators like wolves or bears or lions, like the enemies. He was going to clean out the watering holes to make sure they had clean, pure water to drink. He was literally preparing the table for the sheep. Probably in the presence of the enemies. There were going to be dens of wolves and bears and lions around that he was going to have to scope out to make sure he knew where they were, or clear out to keep them away. He was preparing the tablelands in the presence of those enemies. So the parallel for us in our Christian life is that Christ, our good shepherd, our Jehovah Shammah, has himself already gone before us into every situation and every extremity that we're going to find ourselves in. Okay, our great good shepherd is going ahead of us into every situation, anticipating what danger we might encounter and praying for us that in it we might not succumb. We are told emphatically that he was tempted in every way just as we are. He has known our sufferings. He's known and experienced our sorrows, and he has endured our struggles. Hebrews 4:14 through 16 says this to us. It says, "Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So we are given here a beautiful picture of our Savior, who knows every wile, every trick, every treachery of the enemy, of Satan and his companions, and he knows that we are always in danger of attack. He knows because he's been there. And it's to our great benefit to take advantage of the nearness of Christ in these situations, the nearness of our shepherd, the there-ness of our Jehovah Shammah. It's always the distant sheep, the roamers, the wanderers, the stragglers that are picked off by predators or in danger of attack or getting injured, right? Because he's been there, he understands us, and he has a care and a concern for us beyond our ability to grasp. No wonder he's made every possible provision to ensure that when we have to cope with Satan or with sin or with ourselves, that the contest will not be one-sided. Instead, we can be sure that he has been in this situation before and that he's in it again now with us. And because of this, the prospects of our preservation are excellent. Okay? He has been there. He knows what we're going through, and he knows how best to lead us out of it. And if we will stay near the shepherd, if we will stay near our Jehovah Shammah who is there, then he will lead us out. The third way that Jehovah Shammah can be there, he's beside us in the valleys. He has been there before us, and he knows how we feel, and he knows what we're going through. And the third way is he is Emmanuel, God with us. He is Emmanuel, God with us. Matthew 1:23 says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. His very name told us that he would be with us. Jesus identifies intimately with his people through the picture of the incarnation. God became one of us, just like us, in the person of Jesus Christ. Hebrews 2:17 says, therefore, he had to be made like his brothers, like us, in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. Okay, your next blank says Yahweh is with his people in 3 ways by taking on human likeness. Okay, Emmanuel, God with us. Jehovah is God with us in 3 ways because he became human. The first way is he is familiar with our struggles. He's familiar with our struggles. He's familiar with our temptations, okay? Hebrews 2:18, the next verse after the one we just read, says, for because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. Jesus is able to identify with our struggles with sin, because he himself was tempted. Okay, when you get to Hebrews 4:14 through 15, we just read that a minute ago, it explains it even more. I'll say it again. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. But we do not have a high priest who was unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So when we struggle with something, say we're struggling with a particular sin, say we're struggling with lying, okay? We struggle with lying. Our tendency is to want to go to find another person who struggles with lying, who is a liar, and talk to them about it. We want to talk to them and say, I'm struggling with lying. I'm a liar. You're a liar. Let's be friends. We understand one another because we operate the same way. Let's talk about how we lie. Maybe you have some pointers for me on how to stop lying. Or maybe I can tell you what my struggles have been and you can pray for me. Okay? And that's good. Like, it's not wrong to do that. But it's incomplete. It's inadequate. Okay? Because another liar has given in to lying, right? They may have struggled some, but they haven't struggled enough because they still lie, right? They haven't won the struggle. They're still struggling. And there's beauty in struggling alongside another person and helping each other out of the pit, right? But the blind leading the blind is not a real safe way to get anywhere, right? And so that's not the only help that we need. The best thing for us to do is to go and talk with someone who has won the battle with that sin. Scripture teaches us that the ultimate counselor that we go to is one who has struggled with those temptations that we are struggling with and didn't give in even once. Okay? Now, if Jesus was tempted in every way and never sinned, then he doesn't know what it feels like to sin, does he? No. But does that make him unable to sympathize with us in our struggle with sin? Absolutely not. He is perfectly able to sympathize with us because he struggled more than any one of us ever struggled. Okay? Because he never gave in. We give in to sin and temptation because we get tired of fighting it. Okay? We give in because we don't want to struggle anymore. We quit. We quit struggling. And so we want to give up that tension, that fighting that we're dealing with, that angst, that pain. We want to get rid of it. And so we just finally give in and have what we feel like is a moment of peace from the struggle. Now, the sin that we gave into is going to reap a harvest of anything but peace in our lives. But for that moment, we feel like we have peace because we're not struggling anymore. Jesus never got that moment of peace that we look for when we give in to sin. He fought and fought and fought and struggled and struggled and struggled, and he never gave in. He lived in perpetual angst and tension with temptation because he never gave into it one time. He felt the full force of temptation. Whereas we would give in here or here or here, he never gave in. And so the force of the temptation just built and grew on him. And he felt the full weight of it, which we have never felt, okay, because we give in. So he knows better than we do what it feels like to be tempted. We've never experienced the brunt of the temptation like he did. Only someone, Jesus, who was without sin, faced the full force of Satan's armies and the full force of Satan's temptation. He tasted it all, and he never once sinned. There's a story that kind of parallels this in Greek mythology. It's from the Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus, the hero of the story, he's fighting in the Trojan War, and he is sailing back home with his shipmates. And they have to go past this place where the sirens live. And the sirens were monsters or creatures of Greek mythology who could sing or make this sound that was really appealing to anybody who heard it. And it would draw them in to the sirens, and then the sirens would eat them and destroy them. And so people, anybody who had to sail past them and heard their cries would be destroyed. And so they were very dangerous. So Odysseus wanted to hear the sirens because it was supposed to be the most beautiful sound that a man could hear, but he knew how dangerous it was. So what he did was he had his shipmates put wax in their ears so that they couldn't hear anything that the sirens said or sang. They couldn't hear anything. And he told them to put wax in their ears and to tie him to the crossbeam of the ship. Tie him with ropes and tie him tight. And no matter how much he struggled, they were supposed to hold him tight. He didn't put wax in his ears, so he was going to be able to hear everything that the sirens said. So they tied him up, just like he asked, as tight as they could, and they held him there. And this is what he said. He said, I'm going to hear the sirens, and I'm going to try and struggle, and the more I struggle, the tighter you make the ropes. So that's what they did, and they sailed by. All of the men couldn't hear, but Odysseus did everything he could to get out of what he was tied to on that crossbeam. He faced the full brunt of the temptation of the sirens to go there, but his men and he sailed safely by, okay? So I give you that picture because when it comes to Jesus, our Emmanuel, our Jehovah Shammah, God with us, he had no men to tie him, right? He attached himself to the crossbeam. In fact, he had men who were tempting him not to do it, like Peter saying, surely you won't die. You surely won't let this happen to you. And Satan, I'm sure Satan was right there with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you've seen The Passion of the Christ, that movie that Mel Gibson directed, you might remember the image of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now that whole movie is just like an imagination of what things might have been like during the time of Jesus, and so a lot of that is not straight from the Bible. However, that picture of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane with Satan just kind of prowling around there and whispering to him things that were probably contrary to God's will and God's plan, I'm sure that was happening. I'm absolutely positive that Satan was right there with Jesus in that crucial moment when Jesus was about to go to the cross, and Satan was doing everything he could in his power to keep Jesus from doing that because he knew that was going to be the end of him. That's probably why Jesus was sweating blood, okay? Jesus was being tempted probably more than he had ever been tempted before in that moment to not do what the Father had planned. That's why he says, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Meaning, if Jesus had a will that was different than the Father's, which he says he did, Jesus' will was to not do it. He didn't want to go to the cross. His personal human will was saying, I don't want to do this. He was being tempted not to obey the Father. Probably more than he had been tempted in any other way. So he had Peter telling him not to go to the cross. He had Satan telling him not to go to the cross. But he did it anyway. He faced the full brunt of that temptation. And what we have is a picture of God in the flesh who tied himself to a crossbeam and said, I will not give in to this temptation. And as a result, he knows the full force of every temptation we struggle with at its core, and he is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. So y'all, that gives us so much strength when it comes to the temptations that we face in this world. We pray to a Savior who has conquered every temptation. We're not under that temptation on our own. We have the Savior of the world who conquered that temptation, who destroyed death, and he's able to give us power over every single temptation that we face in this life. And that's such good news. He is familiar with our struggles. He's familiar with our struggle with sin. Okay? That is how Emmanuel is with us in that way. Our Jehovah Shammah is familiar with our struggles, and he's able to help us come out of it. The second way that Emmanuel is with us in human likeness is he is familiar with our sorrow. He's familiar with our sorrow. Isaiah 53:3 says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He's a man who is acquainted with our sorrows. It's an incredible thought, y'all, that Jesus knows how we feel. In John 11, when Mary and Martha are weeping because their brother Lazarus has died, and Jesus shows up, what does he do? He weeps, y'all. He weeps with them. He knows what he's about to do. He knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows. He knows that all of this crying is for naught because he's about to raise Lazarus. But he sees their crying and their sorrow, and he weeps with them because he cares. He empathizes with them, and he knows what they're feeling, and it hurts him that they're hurting. He knows our pain. There's a song that I love that has just become one of my life songs. I don't know if you have songs like this that just stay with you forever. It's called The Silence of God, and it's by Andrew Peterson. I highly recommend him. Go listen to everything he's ever written. It's amazing. But The Silence of God is a song that kind of talks about when you're going through hard times, like those valleys we talked about before, and how sometimes it doesn't feel like God is responding or talking to you. And there's one particular phrase at the end of the song that comes to my mind when I think about the Lord being familiar with our sorrow. And it says this. It's talking about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane that we just talked about. And he says, the man of all sorrows, he never forgot what sorrow is carried by the hearts that he bought. And that gets me every time, you guys, that the man of all sorrows, the man who experienced more sorrow than any human would ever experience, he never forgot what sorrows are carried in the hearts that he bought. He bought my heart with his life on the cross, and he remembers that it's full of sorrow and pain that's caused by the sin in this world. He didn't forget that. Just because he felt more sorrow than I feel, it doesn't mean that he dismisses my sorrow. He feels it the same way that I feel it. It is a beautiful picture to me, and he knows how I'm feeling. He knows my pain. He's familiar with my sorrow. And the third way that our Emmanuel, our Jehovah Shammah, is like us and is with us in human likeness is that he is familiar with our suffering. He's familiar with our suffering. Hebrews 2, verses 10 through 12 say, for it was fitting that he, the Father, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder, Jesus, the founder of their salvation, perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That's why he's not ashamed to call them brothers, calling us brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. Okay, so that little part at the end where it says, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. That is a quote from Psalm 22. It's one of the Messianic Psalms. It's one of the Psalms that talks about Jesus. And the very first verse of that psalm says, my God, why have you forsaken me? The writer of Hebrews is quoting from the psalm that depicts the suffering of Christ on the cross. Okay, so Jesus suffered inexplicably on that cross. Not just the physical suffering, not just the emotional suffering of knowing that people had turned their backs on him, but the spiritual suffering of knowing that his Father had to turn his face away from him because he had become sin. Okay, he was separated from his Father for that period of time, and it was agonizing and excruciating to him. He suffered more than any man will ever suffer. And in that moment, he asked God why. He said, why? Why have you forsaken me? Have you ever asked God why? Have you ever been in the midst of something that you don't understand and you just ask God, why are you doing this to me? Why is this happening? Why am I going through this? Have you ever felt guilty for asking God why? That maybe you shouldn't be able to ask him that question? It's okay to ask God why. Okay, you have to have a posture of submission and humility, but it's okay and good to ask God why. Jesus did. That should bring you comfort. It should comfort you to know that he's familiar with our suffering, even to the extent of asking God why. He's able to sympathize with our weakness, and he knows how we feel. There's this musical term called sympathetic resonance. And what it means is if you were to walk into a room that had really good acoustics, really good sound, and you saw two pianos sitting on the stage, they are perfectly tuned. If you went over to the piano on stage left and you pushed down middle C, if you had a friend standing on the piano, by the piano stage right, and they listened to that piano, it would ring with middle C. He would hear middle C coming out of that piano, not coming out of the stage left piano, but the stage right piano, because they're tuned perfectly, and the frequency of middle C travels through the air and vibrates the middle C string on the stage right piano. And so this piano on stage right is resonating with the same note that the stage left piano is playing, okay? You didn't strike middle C on the stage right piano, but it's resounding with middle C that was struck on the stage left piano. Okay? It's a beautiful picture that when we go through suffering, the notes of suffering are struck in our own lives. And we know that because Jesus became a man, he has a similar instrument in heaven. He has a human body, just like we do. And the notes of our suffering that are struck in our lives are resounding in his instrument, in his human body up in heaven. His instrument, when we experience suffering, resounds at the same time, and he's familiar with our sufferings, okay? Do you know what Jesus is doing right now? What is his job right now? He is sitting on the right hand of God the Father, interceding for us. So when we have suffering in our lives, when our sorrow and our struggle, when our suffering is resounding in this human instrument of our body, it resounds in his body, and he is able to bring that before the Father, right? Which leads us into our next and our fourth way that God, Jehovah Shammah, is there, okay? We said he's beside us, he has been there, he's Emmanuel, God with us, and the last one is he is there for us. He is there for us. Because he is there with us, because he is there in heaven beside the Father, he intercedes for us. Not only does he know how we feel, but Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, Romans 8:34 says, interceding for us, standing before God on our behalf. So let's look at how it unpacks in Hebrews 7, verses 23 through 25. This is what it says. The former priests, meaning the old Israelite priests, the humans that were the high priests that had to go into the Holy of Holies once a year, were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. Okay, all that saying is they had a lot of priests because they kept dying and they had to get new priests. Okay? Even if they were a good priest, eventually they were going to die and their son was going to take their place. And so they just kept having new priest after new priest after new priest. They had many priests because they had to have priests after one died, okay? So the former priests were many because they kept dying. But he, Jesus, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. He never dies. He's eternal. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Okay, so don't forget that Hebrews was written to a people, to the Jewish people who were experiencing deep persecution and suffering because of their commitment to Christ. And the writer is showing them how Christ knows their suffering. Jesus Christ himself lives to intercede for us. He lives to intercede for us. That is his whole job right now. That's all he's doing, is interceding for us. He stands on our behalf before God and intercedes when we go through suffering and when we go through pain. And when families hurt, Jesus resounds with their pain and their suffering, and he intercedes on their behalf. That's the picture, that because he is like us, he is able to intercede for us. He knows what we're going through, and so he can speak firsthand to God the Father about us. The more we walk with Christ and the more we experience different things in this life, the more his humanity will be precious to us day in and day out, trial in and trial out. His humanity and his presence is an amazing, precious, mammoth truth that brings mammoth strength for us. Jesus wants to be with us. He will go ahead of us and prepare the place where we can be with him. He says in Scripture that he's gone before us to prepare a place for us in heaven. He was there before we got there, and he will be with us all along the way. This is our Jehovah Shammah. I hope this name is so beautiful to you as it is to me. I hope that this has expanded your understanding of how God is there with you, how God is Emmanuel with us. And I hope that you're able to interact with him more deeply because of that this week. We have 1 week left. Next week, we're going to do Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals, and El Olam, the Lord, the everlasting God. So 1 more week. Dig in this week. Dig in with the Lord. Spend time with him. And I'll see you next time.